Yeah. So good morning. After this effusive round of introduction, there are many people here who we would like to know of later, but we'll start right away so that we can get into the issues. This meeting came about because of a trigger, and the trigger was the announcement in the current budget in February this year of the establishment of a second gene bank to support conservation efforts by the public and private sector. So what we are looking at is conservation with two agencies involved according to the budget declaration. The public sector, which is the conventional way that gene banks have been done by collection and conservation has been done, not just in India but across the world. The introduction of the private sector into conservation efforts needs some clarification and needs our attention. Attention to the simple fact that, as we all know, everybody who's sitting in this room is very well aware of the contestation around genetic resources. Genetic resources are now the new oil, if you will. These are some of the most precious resources in the world today, and there are very few countries and societies that are actually owners of both the genetic resources. And I might add, in the case of India and a few other countries, the other huge advantage that we have is that we not only have the genetic resources, but we also have the indigenous knowledge associated with it. So it's not some yellow flowers and blue flowers, it is yellow flowers that have dysfunction. It is this rice variety that does that. It is this sorghum, this barley, this whatever. We know what it does. We meaning the farmers. So at the moment we mention farmers, we are acknowledging that in conservation, the primary agents who have carried this burden and this responsibility through ages, and when I say ages, I mean a long time frame, is the farming community. Conservation cannot happen without them. It has not happened without them. And therefore, when we talk about conservation support in a budgetary context, it is imperative that we by name include the farming community. It's not enough to say public sector and private sector. The government of India doesn't own the germplasm. State governments don't own the germplasm. Scientific institutions don't own the germplasm. The people of India own it. Who are the people of India? The diverse groups. The farming community perhaps being the most prominent. With this background, I think we should proceed to understand what conservation support would mean in the budget and what we as a group of informed, concerned, and active participants in this exercise of collecting and conserving and categorizing germplasm need to have a view on this, and that is why this meeting has been called. So that we talk to each other and we decide on what we want to submit to the government in terms of a policy recommendation for the conservation of germplasm in the new context, which will also have retrospective impacts on the old gene bank. So let's take this very seriously. I would like to know, first of all, what has been the track record of the private sector in terms of accessing genetic material from the national gene banks. What has been the track record? How much material have they accessed? How much material have they put in? What products have been made from these accessed germplasm? How much benefit sharing has been paid into the National Gene Fund? As we all know, when we develop national legislation, the PPBFR and the Biodiversity Act, there is a provision for the National Gene Fund for sharing or receiving the benefits due to the utilization of genetic resources. And I have been an expert member of both these committees, the Biodiversity Act and the PTDFRA. And one of the things we established right at the beginning was this gene fund. Highly contested, I might add, because the committee had many kinds of members, but it got established. It got established to be just and fair to Adivasi farming communities who have conserved germplasm, who have held on to it, who own the knowledge about it, and who therefore must be paid for the utilization of their resource. Just like you're very happy to pay a technology transfer fee to an industry when you use their technology, please be equally happy to pay into a national gene fund when you use the germplasm conserved by the farming community. That is the basis of how we will discuss what the second gene bank and the private sector involvement in that will be. I'm just going to flag a couple of issues because we're going to break out into groups to discuss this in a bit of detail, but I want to flag that. What do I want to flag? What will be the nature of this conservation support? Is the government of India going to give budgetary financial support to the private sector to go out there and collect germplasm? Please flag that, whichever group is going to discuss it. What does collection and conservation mean? Is the private sector going to farmers' fields and collect germplasm? Are we going to give them that access? Because as you can figure out, there will be a trillion leakages in a process like that. I am whoever, company X, and I go and I have access to go into farmers' fields and start collecting germplasm. What do I do with that germplasm? Who's monitoring that? Under which rules, regulations will that collection of germplasm be allowed? We need to be very clear about that. Before anyone starts raising their hands to protest, let me absolutely clarify in no uncertain terms that the private sector, and please, I'm not making the private sector out to be some adversary, they're not. But given the track record, I think we need to be very careful about protecting public sector interests, farmers' interests, the interests of custodian farmers, the interests of field gene banks, the interests of community seed banks, and that's why we are discussing community seed banks today. Community seed banks is only a cachet to include farmers, custodian farmers, field gene banks, all the agencies that are doing conservation in the field. Conservation is not only in gene banks. It's being done in many, many places. And when we talk of conservation in policy, we need to take into account all of these places, all of these agencies. So when conservation support, I think we need to flag, for example, is the private sector going to collect and put it into the national gene bank? Or are they going to set up their own gene bank? Or what? When they put it into the national gene bank, it will have to be subject to exactly the same rules, regulations, and guidelines as any other collection. That means all the material transfer agreements, the commitment to benefit sharing, all of those provisions that are allowed, that are provided for. And as I started to say and digressed, for anyone who is thinking that this is adversarial to the private sector, let me emphasize it is not. Today, as it stands, the private sector has absolute, complete access to everything that is in the gene bank, whichever gene bank. It has complete access. Nobody has anything in terms of policy to deter the access of the private sector. So please don't get up and start shouting hurrah, it's all anti-private sector. It's not. Let me emphasize, it's not. The access to gene banks, the access to germplasm is governed by the clause of benefit sharing. Has that been complied with? Has the private sector, when it has used germplasm, paid into the National Gene Fund? I'm afraid the track on that is extremely meager. It's very easy to check what is put into the Gene Fund. The 4 rupees 50 paisa is not commensurate with the germplasm that has been accessed. So we need to see, the access is guaranteed in law. So is the benefit sharing compulsion guaranteed in law. Is it being complied with? because the track record of all sectors, private and public, will inform the decision and will inform the policy framework of how we go forward with including the private sector in the conservation efforts of the second gene bank that is proposed, or even the existing gene banks. So, apart from the fact that we need to enunciate the fact that the private sector is a player, we need to regulate in which context the private sector will continue to be a player, and this will be informed by what the track record of the private sector is. There are many questions that will arise in the conservation arena of both the private and the public sector. If we look at the public sector, and let's also talk about the public sector. How much support do community seed banks get? All this budget outlay that we are grandly announcing for the private and the public sector, is it all going to go to scientific institutions? All the NDPGR banks, it must go there. It must go to the scientific institutions. But equally, it must go to the efforts of communities, the community seed banks. Are they being supported? They're not. So when we talk about conservation support, who do we include in this support? When the government has got 100 rupees to spend on conservation support, who are going to get shares of this 100 rupees? Let us be very clear, and I would say, at the risk of prompting a discussion, let us be very clear that participants or the recipients of any government support, any budgetary support, and when I say government support, I think all of you know that it's your money and my money, and that's the support. Our support for conservation must be determined by us. And it must go to custodian farmers, it must go to community seed banks, it must go to individual farmers who are conserving, it must go to several civil society groups that are making an effort to conserve genetic resources. Gene Campaign conserved almost 1,000 traditional rice varieties from its collections in Eastern India. Dev is working in trying to conserve other varieties. There are groups in Kerala, Kannal, and others who are doing work at their level. There are many civil society organizations, and if you look at the list, it's an impressive list of groups and people who are conserving germplasm. There is also this whole thing about community seed banks, which is almost a category that is recognized. So when we say conservation support, let us flag these agencies as totally absolute recipients of any conservation support that the budget decides to allocate to conservation. But I will not shy away from the fact that the areas of concern here are access to materials by which agencies, and how has subversion of policy aided and facilitated this? How have the original legislation on the PPVFR and the Biodiversity Act, how have these been subverted? What are the international developments that are taking place? Because this is not an isolated development. Our suddenly leaping out of the box and saying we are going to provide conservation support to the public and private sector is not an isolated thing. It is part of what is happening internationally, of how genetic material is sought to be made into a freely accessible resource. It's as though OPEC has allowed anybody to go into their oil fields and start pumping out oil. They don't. And we should either. So I'm happy, and I think Dinesh Abrol is going to go into the details of. Dinesh, I hope you're paying attention to what I'm saying to you. Yeah. You're listening. Of what he will say about what the international trends are. The IPPGR is doing also very funny stuff on genetic resources. I'm glad Kavita is here, Kavita Kulkarni, who's sitting there. And I hope she will be talking about how the policy framework is being subverted. We talked about the PPVFR, the CPS, and the rules of the biodiversity legislation, rules framework of that act are also being compromised. So there is that happening as well. That already established institutions, already established policy frameworks are being now filled with. I remember attending a presentation at a conference pre-COVID days where there was an American presenter from one of the American institutions, the USA, who presented a fairly aggressive presentation on why India's legislative framework on plant varieties, because we all know we opted for the sui generis legislation, and India's sui generis legislation is still the only legislation in the world that grants rights to farmers, not exemptions from UPER, rights, standalone rights. So there are breeders' rights and there are farmers' rights. And this has been a huge sticking point for companies because of being an impediment to free and unfettered access to farmer varieties. There was this very aggressive presentation that the Indian law is not fair and it is protectionist and so on. I also served on the committee. I'm sorry to make this I think, but I'm sharing my personal experiences of which trends we have witnessed in the last years. I've also been part of the country's agrobiodiversity management committee, where all sectors were involved, as it should be, and where there was a barely concealed effort to provide access to the private sector to all the genetic material in the gene bank. Fair enough, that access is already there. But the access should be accompanied by dilution of the provisions of access, primarily benefit sharing. So let us pay attention to all of these features. When we come up with a new, at least we flag the areas that we want to be included in the new framework that will cover whatever happens with the city conservation effort. Let us also keep in mind that we need to produce a fair and balanced. This is not an anti-somebody pro-somebody. Let's not degenerate our discussion into that. But what is equitable and what is fair? And when I say what is equitable and what is fair, let me come back to benefit sharing. What should be the volume of benefit sharing and what should be the nature of the terms? I find that Government of India still is in pre-liberalization mode, when the maximum courage it has in legislation and policy to impose a penalty is 5 rupees 50 paisa. And the world has moved beyond that. We're talking in 3 years. We're talking in company profits, certainly more in pharma than in agriculture, going into crores. So let's beg our benefit sharing on the likely earnings from a product that is developed out of genetic material accessed from a public bank. When I say public bank, it could be anyone's bank. It could be just a farmer's. We know enough by biases going on. So when we discuss how much should be the benefit shared, let us assume, I did an exercise for UNCTAD once on the pharma sector. Let us assume the profits accrued from a new drug on their own admission, 2 billion. And 2 billion is a conservative amount. Work backwards from that. Okay, so when you've taken my Rolfia serpentina, you know its properties, you know it can be used for controlling blood pressure, cardiac ailments. You've already got the know-how. You don't have to do lab work to figure out what the properties are. So you save that much. You say that all this, because when you want to claim IPR, you say it cost me 1 billion in terms of research, clinical trials, so on and so forth. So let's work. You've taken 1 billion words from me anyway when you took the Rolfia serpentina with its properties, and work backwards from that. And so therefore, 10% of benefit of that is 500 million, 300 million, whatever figure you come to. Let the calculation be transparent. And in the case of plant varieties, it will not be 2 billion and stuff, although I don't know anymore. I'm still talking of an era of plant varieties which is normal products and not hyped up super things. But take a figure. This is the likely profit that you will generate from a variety that you develop out of an accession from the gene bank or from a custodian farmer, etc. Work backwards from that, and 10% of that benefit works out to 5 crores, 2 crores, whatever. This must be transparent so that nobody can say these are false figures. But for heaven's sake, get your act together and move to a level that is contemporary in the world today, not something that was there in 1950. That should be the volume of your benefit that you should claim from access. On the subject of penalty, there are violations galore. Recently, Sharad Babu was telling me about this Patanjali thing. Our jet set Swami Ramdev, Patanjali. They used a stash of stuff and refused to pay any benefit sharing. When people protested and the government agency protested, they just went over their heads, got themselves an exemption and didn't pay. Now we have to guard against that. File a public interest litigation. I don't know where the woman what's up there. But yeah, get onto the streets, protest. Burn a bus. I'm not serious. That was just a joke. Don't burn the bus. But protest. If the court does not give you relief, which is becoming increasingly the case, get onto the streets. But protest. We become languid in our opposition and objections. So, what should be the penalty for violation? At least let's put that into the law, into the regulation, into the framework. And again, for penalty, work backwards from what the potential or construed profits would be. So, stealing that amount of money, X amount of money, you've stolen it by not paying the benefit sharing. This is your penalty. 5 years in jail, non-bailable. Let that be vetted by the experts and see what kind of penalty. But the penalty has to be a deterrent. The penalty cannot be a joke. So let the penalty be a deterrent. And smarter heads than mine will advise on what will be a fair penalty. These are some of the things I wanted to flag. I hope that we will take these up in our breakout groups and that we will come up at the end of the day through all the huge amount of effort put in by Sharad Babu, Suman, and all their friends and acquaintances who have put this meeting together very, very short notice and done a terrific job. So I think a round of applause to the organizers. Just clap for it. All right, guys, there we go.